It was a busy evening at the restaurant, with the hum of conversations filling the air and waiters darting between tables. The smell of sizzling steaks and fresh-baked bread wafted through the room, creating an inviting warmth. Mr. Charles stepped inside, pausing just past the entrance. He wasn't dressed in anything fancy, just a plain sweater and slacks, but his posture carried a quiet confidence. The years had added silver to his hair, and his hands bore the marks of a life well lived, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the scene with a subtle smile. He stood near the hostess podium, waiting patiently. The young hostess seemed flustered, juggling menus and phone calls, and hadn't noticed him yet. Mr. Charles didn't mind. He simply glanced around, observing the crowd. Families laughed at their tables, couples clinked their glasses, and the soft music in the background completed the lively scene. That's when Rick appeared, the manager. He was a middle-aged man, dressed sharply in a button-down shirt with his name tag pinned just above his chest. His movements were brisk, almost exaggerated, as if he needed everyone to know he was in charge. His eyes landed on Mr. Charles, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He made his way over, brushing past the hostess without a word. "Can I help you?" Rick asked, his tone more impatient than welcoming. Mr. Charles turned to him, his smile polite. "Good evening. I'd like a table for one, please." Rick raised an eyebrow, giving him a once-over. There was a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, the kind that wasn't meant to be kind. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. A flicker of surprise crossed Mr. Charles's face, but he quickly masked it. "Yes, I am," he replied simply, his voice calm. Rick chuckled under his breath, loud enough to be heard. "Well, it's gonna be a long wait," he said, glancing around the half-full restaurant. There were clearly open tables, but Rick wasn't interested in fairness. "You might want to try somewhere else. Something more in your range." The comment hung in the air like a bad odor. A few customers at nearby tables looked over, their expressions uneasy, but no one said a word. The young hostess froze, her cheeks turning pink as she stared down at her menus. Mr. Charles didn't flinch. He simply looked Rick in the eye and said, "I don't mind waiting." His calm demeanor seemed to irritate Rick even more. "Suit yourself," Rick snapped, stepping back. "But like I said, it's gonna be a while." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Mr. Charles standing there. The older man glanced at the empty tables again, then at the hostess, who still couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. Without another word, Mr. Charles stepped aside and waited near the entrance, his expression unreadable. People around him whispered quietly, unsure of how to react. But Mr. Charles didn't seem bothered. He stood there, patient as ever, like a man who knew something no one else did. Minutes passed, and the air grew heavier with tension. Mr. Charles remained near the entrance, his calm presence almost unsettling, in contrast to the bustling restaurant. A waiter glanced his way, hesitant, as if debating whether to approach, but one stern look from Rick stopped him in his tracks. Rick moved through the room with an air of superiority, ensuring everyone saw him as the man in charge. As Rick passed the bar, a customer sitting nearby whispered to a friend, "That man at the door, he looks so calm. What's he waiting for?" The friend shrugged. "I don't know, but the way Rick's treating him, it's not right." At that moment, a family of 4 entered the restaurant, their chatter filling the space. The hostess perked up and greeted them warmly. Rick stepped forward with a broad smile and led them to a table, one of the very tables Mr. Charles had pointed out earlier. It was empty, available, and now taken. Rick glanced back at Mr. Charles with a faint smirk, as if daring him to say something. Mr. Charles didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. His voice, though low, carried a commanding tone that seemed to quiet the whispers around him. "Yes, it's me," he said, his words measured. "I'm at the location now. You might want to come by." There was a pause, followed by a faint response on the other end of the line. Mr. Charles nodded, his gaze drifting to the restaurant's sign, visible through the window. "Yes, the manager is here. You'll see why when you arrive." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression remaining calm. The quiet authority in his voice unsettled those who overheard, though Rick, now back at the counter, remained oblivious. "What's he doing now?" a server murmured to another. "Called someone, I think," the other replied, glancing nervously at Rick. "Doesn't seem like he's leaving anytime soon." Mr. Charles turned to him, his smile polite. "Good evening. I'd like a table for one, please." Rick raised an eyebrow, giving him a once-over. There was a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, the kind that wasn't meant to be kind. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. A flicker of surprise crossed Mr. Charles's face, but he quickly masked it. "Yes, I am," he replied simply, his voice calm. Rick chuckled under his breath, loud enough to be heard. "Well, it's going to be a long wait," he said, glancing around the half-full restaurant. There were clearly open tables, but Rick wasn't interested in fairness. "You might want to try somewhere else, something more in your range." The comment hung in the air like a bad odor. A few customers at nearby tables looked over, their expressions uneasy, but no one said a word. The young hostess froze, her cheeks turning pink as she stared down at her menus. Mr. Charles didn't flinch. He simply looked Rick in the eye and said, "I don't mind waiting." His calm demeanor seemed to irritate Rick even more. "Suit yourself," Rick snapped, stepping back. "But like I said, it's gonna be a while." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Mr. Charles standing there. The older man glanced at the empty tables again, then at the hostess, who still couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. Without another word, Mr. Charles stepped aside and waited near the entrance, his expression unreadable. People around him whispered quietly, unsure of how to react. But Mr. Charles didn't seem bothered. He stood there, patient as ever, like a man who knew something no one else did. Minutes passed, and the air grew heavier with tension. Mr. Charles remained near the entrance, his calm presence almost unsettling in contrast to the bustling restaurant. A waiter glanced his way, hesitant, as if debating whether to approach, but one stern look from Rick stopped him in his tracks. Rick moved through the room with an air of superiority, ensuring everyone saw him as the man in charge. As Rick passed the bar, a customer sitting nearby whispered to a friend, "That man at the door, he looks so calm. What's he waiting for?" The friend shrugged. "I don't know, but the way Rick's treating him, it's not right." At that moment, a family of 4 entered the restaurant, their chatter filling the space. The hostess perked up and greeted them warmly. Rick stepped forward with a broad smile and led them to a table, one of the very tables Mr. Charles had pointed out earlier. It was empty, available, and now taken. Rick glanced back at Mr. Charles with a faint smirk, as if daring him to say something. Mr. Charles didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. His voice, though low, carried a commanding tone that seemed to quiet the whispers around him. "Yes, it's me," he said, his words measured. "I'm at the location now. You might want to come by." There was a pause, followed by a faint response on the other end of the line. Mr. Charles nodded, his gaze drifting to the restaurant's sign, visible through the window. "Yes, the manager is here. You'll see why when you arrive." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression remaining calm. The quiet authority in his voice unsettled those who overheard, though Rick, now back at the counter, remained oblivious. "What's he doing now?" a server murmured to another. "Called someone, I think," the other replied, glancing nervously at Rick. "Doesn't seem like he's leaving anytime soon." Rick turned his head, catching their whisper. "What's the big deal?" he barked. "He'll leave when he gets tired of standing. Trust me, people like him always do." His words carried just enough volume to be heard by Mr. Charles, but the older man didn't react. He simply shifted his weight slightly and glanced at his watch. The scene began to shift as the air outside filled with the soft hum of an approaching car. Heads turned as a sleek black luxury sedan rolled into the parking lot. The vehicle, spotless and imposing, gleamed under the restaurant's lights. It came to a smooth stop, and two men in tailored suits stepped out, their presence commanding attention before they even reached the door. Inside, the murmurs grew louder. Even Rick noticed the arrival, his smirk faltering as he watched the suited men stride purposefully toward the entrance. One of them opened the door for Mr. Charles, exchanging a brief nod with him before stepping aside. Rick straightened up, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Who are they?" he muttered under his breath. He was about to find out, but the realization was coming far too late. As the two suited men entered the restaurant, their polished shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Their expressions were sharp, their presence radiating authority. They didn't glance at the tables or the staff. Their focus was singular, and it landed squarely on Rick. Rick cleared his throat, forcing himself to look composed. Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his tone slightly less confident than before. One of the men, taller and older with streaks of gray in his neatly combed hair, didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for Mr. Charles, who had stepped forward with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained all evening. The older man now stood at the center of the room, an air of quiet power surrounding him. "Rick, isn't it?" the taller executive said, his voice cutting through the silence. Rick nodded, his smile forced. "That's right. I'm the manager here. Is there a problem?" The man didn't answer. He simply turned to Mr. Charles, who now spoke for the first time in a tone that commanded the room's attention. "Rick, let me reintroduce myself. I'm Charles Andrews, founder and owner of this entire restaurant chain." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the room as customers and staff exchanged wide-eyed looks. Rick's face went pale, his smug demeanor crumbling in an instant. "Wait. What?" he stammered, looking between Mr. Charles and the executives. You own the company?" "That's correct," Mr. Charles replied evenly, his gaze never leaving Rick. "And tonight, I had the unfortunate experience of seeing how my staff is treated by the person I trusted to manage this location." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked to the executives for support, but their expressions were as stern as Mr. Charles's. The taller executive stepped forward, addressing the staff and customers in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andrews is not only the owner of this chain, but the visionary who built it from the ground up. His values are the foundation of this business: respect, dignity, and inclusion. What happened here tonight is not just unacceptable. It's a violation of everything this company stands for." Rick's hands trembled slightly as he tried to salvage the situation. I didn't know who he was," he blurted out, his voice shaky. Mr. Charles tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor never wavering. And would it have mattered if I wasn't the owner? Would you have treated me any differently? The question sliced through the room like a blade, leaving Rick utterly speechless. The murmurs from the tables grew louder as customers whispered amongst themselves, some recording the moment on their phones. The other executive, younger but equally authoritative, stepped forward with a clipboard in hand. Rick, as of this moment, you're relieved of your duties. Please collect your belongings and leave the premises immediately. Rick's eyes widened in disbelief. Wait, you can't just fire me. Yes, we can. The taller executive interrupted sharply, and we just did. Rick stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of anger, humiliation, and panic. He glanced around the room, as if searching for someone to back him up, but the silent stares from staff and customers offered no support. With no other choice, he turned and stormed toward the back office, his footsteps heavy with defeat. As the door slammed shut behind Rick, the room erupted into quiet applause. Customers and staff alike couldn't hide their relief, their respect for Mr. Charles evident in their expressions. But Mr. Charles raised a hand, signaling for silence. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is about how we treat each other, no matter who we are or where we come from. Respect is not optional. It's a standard we should all live by." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't out of fear or tension. It was out of admiration. Mr. Charles's words resonated deeply, leaving an impression far more lasting than Rick's actions ever could. As the applause faded, Mr. Charles looked around the room, his calm gaze settling on the staff. Many of them stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. A young waitress near the kitchen wiped her eyes discreetly, her relief evident. The hostess, who had been hesitant to meet Mr. Charles's eyes earlier, now stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Andrews," she began, her voice shaky but sincere. "I'm so sorry for how you were treated. I should have said something, but—" Her words trailed off as her emotions got the better of her. Mr. Charles offered her a kind smile. "It's all right," he said gently. "Standing up in moments like that isn't easy, especially when the consequences feel uncertain. But remember, your voice matters. Always." The young hostess nodded, her cheeks reddening as the weight of his words sank in. Mr. Charles turned to the two executives. "Make sure every staff member here receives proper training on how to handle situations like this. No one should feel powerless to do what's right." The taller executive nodded immediately. "Consider it done, sir, and we'll ensure the new management team is aligned with the values you built this company on." Satisfied, Mr. Charles walked toward the nearest empty table, the same one Rick had insisted wasn't available earlier. He gestured toward the young hostess. "Now, can you help me with a menu? I believe I was promised a good meal when I walked in." The request, simple yet deliberate, sent a ripple of emotion through the staff. The hostess nodded quickly, her nervousness giving way to a genuine smile. "Of course, sir. Right away." As Mr. Charles settled into his seat, the room seemed to exhale collectively. The staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose, and the customers, many of whom had been watching with bated breath, now whispered amongst themselves in awe. "I can't believe he owns the whole chain," one man murmured to his wife. "And did you hear what he said? About respect? That's a lesson for all of us," she replied, nodding. The young waitress who had been near tears moments ago approached Mr. Charles's table with a glass of water. Her hands shook slightly as she set it down. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice trembling with gratitude. "For what?" Mr. Charles asked, his tone warm. "For reminding us that people like Rick don't define this place," she said, "and for standing up for yourself. It means a lot." Mr. Charles's smile widened slightly. Sometimes, standing up isn't about shouting or making a scene. It's about knowing your worth and letting the truth speak for itself. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The staff moved with more confidence, and the customers who had witnessed the ordeal seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. While Mr. Charles began to enjoy his meal, the young hostess, now standing at the podium with a newfound sense of pride, greeted a family that had just entered. Her smile was genuine, her posture firm. And outside, Rick stood by his car, his shoulders slumped as he glanced back at the restaurant. The sting of his humiliation burned deep, but deeper still was the lesson he couldn't escape. Inside, Mr. Charles finished his meal with the quiet dignity that had carried him through the evening. As he prepared to leave, several customers approached, thanking him for his words and actions. He responded with kindness, his message clear. Respect was not just a principle, it was a necessity. And as he walked out of the restaurant, the staff and customers watched him go, knowing they'd just witnessed something far greater than an act of justice. They'd seen a masterclass in humility, strength, and the true meaning of leadership. As Mr. Charles stepped outside into the cool evening air, the restaurant behind him was still buzzing with the aftermath of his powerful presence. The two executives followed closely, their expressions a mix of respect and urgency. One of them, the younger of the two, caught up with him just as he reached his car. "Mr. Andrews," he said, his tone filled with genuine admiration. "That was remarkable. I've seen you handle difficult situations before, but this, you didn't just teach Rick a lesson, you reminded all of us why this company exists." Mr. Charles turned to face him, his hand resting lightly on the door handle of his car. "This company isn't about the food," he said plainly. "It's about the people who walk through those doors. Every single one of them deserves to be treated with dignity, whether they're serving the meal or paying for it." The taller executive, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "What would you like us to do about the situation moving forward, sir? We'll replace Rick immediately, but should we address this publicly?" Mr. Charles considered the question for a moment, his eyes scanning the parking lot as though weighing every possible consequence. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, but not as an attack on Rick or anyone else. Use this as an opportunity to reaffirm our values. Make it clear that no one, customer or staff, should ever feel less than human in one of our establishments." The executives nodded in unison, their resolve clear. Mr. Charles opened his car door, but before getting in, he turned back to them. "And make sure you check on the staff. They've been through enough under that man's leadership. They need to know they're supported." "Yes, sir," the taller executive replied immediately. Mr. Charles nodded, satisfied, and slid into the driver's seat. The car's engine hummed to life, its sleek design as understated as the man behind the wheel. As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of the restaurant. The faint reflection of the neon sign glowed against the darkened glass, a reminder of the legacy he had built. Inside, the restaurant was slowly returning to normal, but the atmosphere was undeniably changed. The staff moved with a new energy, emboldened by the events of the evening. The young hostess, now speaking with confidence, greeted each customer warmly, her voice steady. The waitress who had spoken to Mr. Charles earlier worked with a visible lightness in her step, her faith in the company restored. Meanwhile, Rick sat slumped in his car, staring at the empty parking lot. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages, likely from friends or family, who had already seen the viral videos circulating online. Each notification was a harsh reminder of the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his career, he wasn't in control, and the weight of his arrogance was crushing. Back in the restaurant, one of the customers who had witnessed the scene leaned toward his wife as they finished their meal. That man, Mr. Andrews. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. That's true power, she replied, her voice thoughtful. It's not just about owning a company. It's about owning your integrity. The words echoed quietly in the room, reflecting the sentiment of everyone present. Mr. Charles's actions had left a mark, not just on the staff or the customers, but on the values they would carry forward. And somewhere down the road, as the headlights of his car illuminated the path ahead, Mr. Charles drove on, knowing he had done more than defend himself. He had set an example, a quiet, powerful reminder that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you live by. The next morning, the fallout from the previous night's events began to spread like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation between Mr. Charles and Rick flooded social media, shared thousands of times with captions like, "This is how you teach respect," and "The owner of the restaurant chain handled this with class." Comments poured in, from people applauding Mr. Charles's calm yet powerful approach. Within hours, major news outlets picked up the story. Headlines like, "Restaurant chain owner faces racism from his own manager," and "A lesson in leadership. How one man turned humiliation into change," dominated social media feeds. Mr. Charles's name, once known only within corporate circles, became a symbol of quiet strength and justice. Meanwhile, Rick's humiliation deepened. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, some from angry friends or former colleagues, others from reporters seeking a statement. He ignored them all, unable to face the reality that his arrogance had not only cost him his job, but also his reputation. At the restaurant, the staff gathered before opening for an emergency meeting called by the executives. The atmosphere was tense, but there was an underlying sense of hope, a feeling that things were finally changing. The taller executive stood at the front of the room, addressing the team. "First, let me start by apologizing to every single one of you for what you endured under Rick's management. His behavior doesn't represent this company, and we are committed to making sure it never happens again." The younger executive stepped forward, adding, "Mr. Andrews has made it clear that this restaurant, and every other location in the chain, must reflect the values he founded this company on: respect, dignity, and equality. Moving forward, we'll be providing additional training for all staff to ensure these principles are upheld." The staff exchanged glances, some nodding, others visibly relieved. The hostess from the previous night raised her hand timidly. Will Mr. Andrews be visiting again?" The executives smiled knowingly. "Mr. Andrews plans to visit every location over the next few months. He wants to meet the people who make this company run and ensure they feel valued." The room buzzed with excitement and pride. The staff knew they were part of something bigger, a company that genuinely cared about its people. As the day went on, customers streamed in, many of them mentioning the viral video. Some came specifically to show support for the staff and Mr. Charles, leaving generous tips and kind words. The atmosphere in the restaurant was lighter, filled with an energy that hadn't been there before. By evening, a framed photo of Mr. Charles was placed near the entrance, accompanied by a plaque that read, "In this place, we treat everyone with respect. That's not just a rule, it's our way of life." Far from the restaurant, Mr. Charles sat in his modest home, sipping a cup of tea. The TV in the corner played a segment about the viral video, the reporter praising his composure and leadership. He watched silently, his expression unreadable. His phone buzzed with a message from one of the executives. "Staff morale is through the roof. Customers are pouring in. Your message resonated, sir." Mr. Charles put the phone down and stared out the window, the quiet of the evening wrapping around him. He wasn't interested in fame or applause. For him, the victory wasn't in the headlines or the viral attention. It was in knowing that he had turned a moment of disrespect into a lasting lesson. And as the world continued to talk about his actions, Mr. Charles remained the same. A man of quiet strength, steady values, and an unwavering belief in the power of respect. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Mr. Charles's actions extended far beyond the restaurant. Across the country, other branches of the chain began sharing their own stories of improvement. Staff at various locations reported feeling a renewed sense of pride in their work. Posters with Mr. Charles's message, "Respect is not just a rule, it's a way of life," were displayed in break rooms and customer areas alike, serving as a constant reminder of the company's core values. Rick's situation, however, grew bleaker. The video of his behavior continued to circulate online, with viewers dissecting every word and action. The comments were relentless, calling him out for his arrogance and disrespect. Local news outlets ran stories about the incident, and soon his name became synonymous with workplace discrimination. Despite his attempts to avoid the spotlight, his reputation was irreparably damaged. Meanwhile, Mr. Charles quietly resumed his daily life. He wasn't one to bask in attention or let the moment define him. Yet, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming response from people who had reached out, sharing stories of their own experiences with prejudice and how his actions had inspired them. Letters arrived at his office, emails poured in, and even strangers on the street stopped him to express their gratitude. One day, Mr. Charles received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was the young hostess from the restaurant. She stood nervously at the door, clutching a small envelope in her hands. "Mr. Andrews," she began softly, "I just wanted to thank you in person. What you did that night, it changed everything for us. The staff, the customers, we all feel it. And it gave me the courage to finally stand up for myself." Mr. Charles gestured for her to sit, his warm smile putting her at ease. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "But remember, the courage was always there. Sometimes it just needs a little push." She handed him the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "This is from the staff. We all wanted you to know how much you mean to us." Inside was a handwritten letter, signed by every employee at the restaurant, along with a small token, a framed photo of the entire team standing together, smiling. The words at the bottom read, "Thank you for showing us what leadership looks like." For a moment, Mr. Charles said nothing, his eyes scanning the letter and the photo. Then he looked up, his expression softer than before. "This means more to me than you'll ever know," he said sincerely. The hostess nodded, her own smile growing. "We're proud to work for someone like you." As she left, Mr. Charles placed the photo on his desk, where it joined a few other mementos of his journey. It served as a quiet reminder of the difference one moment of action could make. That evening, Mr. Charles visited another branch of the restaurant chain, walking in unannounced, just as he had before. This time, however, the staff greeted him with wide smiles and genuine warmth. The manager, clearly aware of who he was, personally escorted him to a table. As he sat down to enjoy his meal, Mr. Charles noticed a family nearby, whispering and pointing in his direction. A young boy, no older than 10, finally gathered the courage to approach him. "Excuse me." the boy said shyly, clutching a phone in his hands. "Are you the man from the video? The one who owns all the restaurants?" Mr. Charles chuckled softly, nodding. "I suppose I am. And what's your name, young man?" "Daniel," the boy replied. "My mom showed me your video. She said you taught everyone a really important lesson." Mr. Charles leaned forward slightly, meeting the boy's curious gaze. "And what did you learn from it, Daniel?" The boy thought for a moment, then said confidently, "That you should always respect people, no matter what." Mr. Charles smiled, his heart warmed by the simplicity and truth of the boy's words. "That's exactly right, Daniel. And if you remember that, you'll do just fine in life." As the boy returned to his family, Mr. Charles leaned back in his chair, watching the world around him. The restaurant was alive with laughter and kindness, a reflection of the values he had worked so hard to uphold. In that moment, he knew his work wasn't just about running a business. It was about building a legacy of respect, one moment at a time. As Mr. Charles sat there, the warmth of the restaurant surrounding him, a strange feeling began to settle in his chest. It wasn't pride, exactly, but something quieter. Satisfaction mixed with the weight of responsibility. He'd set out to enjoy a simple meal, and had instead become a symbol for something far bigger than himself. As he finished his meal, a waiter approached, placing the check gently on the table. "It's on the house, Mr. Andrews," he said, a nervous but proud smile on his face. Mr. Charles shook his head with a soft chuckle. "No, son, I don't take handouts, not even from my own restaurant. Bring me the bill, and I'll pay just like everyone else." The waiter nodded, his admiration growing. He returned moments later with the receipt, which Mr. Charles quietly reviewed, before tucking a generous tip under the edge of the plate. Just as he stood to leave, a man entered the restaurant, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the evening. It was Rick. His once pristine attire was now rumpled, his demeanor stripped of its former arrogance. He hesitated near the door, clearly unsure of whether to approach. The staff noticed him, but said nothing, their gazes wary. Rick finally mustered the courage to step forward, his eyes locking with Mr. Charles's. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, Rick was at a loss, not because of fear, but because of shame. Mr. Charles didn't move, his expression unreadable. The restaurant fell silent, every pair of eyes watching the interaction. Rick swallowed hard, then finally managed, "Mr. Andrews, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, fragile yet genuine. The staff exchanged glances, unsure of what would happen next. Mr. Charles studied Rick for a long moment, his sharp eyes seeming to see right through him. "I believe you," Mr. Charles said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But an apology isn't enough. Respect isn't something you just say. It's something you live." Rick nodded quickly, his voice trembling. "I know. I want to make things right." Mr. Charles tilted his head slightly, considering Rick's words. Making things right isn't about undoing what's been done. It's about doing better from this point forward. He paused, his tone softening. "You have a long road ahead, Rick. I hope you walk it with humility." Rick's shoulders slumped, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He nodded, then turned to leave, his figure disappearing into the night. Mr. Charles turned back to the restaurant, where the staff and customers were still watching. He offered them a small smile, one that seemed to ease the tension in the room. "Let's all get back to what we came here for," he said simply. The staff returned to their duties, and the hum of conversation slowly resumed. Mr. Charles walked to the door, the quiet strength of his presence lingering behind him. As he stepped into the cool night air, He glanced up at the stars. He didn't need accolades or recognition. All he cared about was that respect, real, lasting respect, had taken root in that place. And as the door closed behind him, leaving the restaurant filled with life and warmth, Mr. Charles walked away, knowing he had made his mark in the most profound way. Some legacies are built in boardrooms, others are built in moments of quiet strength. Mr. Charles's legacy was both, and it would echo far beyond that small restaurant, carried forward by every person who had witnessed his actions that night.